Good afternoon, and welcome to Making Ajax Sexy. If you get tired of listening to me and just feel like being geeky, you can just go right to the source and just skip ahead to the good parts. It's up on GitHub. If you'd like to read some hastily scribed documentation, you can also check out my website, sexyjs.com. But I have to warn you that it's actually been deemed too risque for the workplace by this guy, who was very direct in his opinion. And it's unfortunate because I think there's one less user, that I've reached. But if you think it's not safe for work, but you'd still like to try it, I've created another version for you. Just passed that along, and you can have a Netscape Navigator 4 experience. But at least it's compatible and compliant. Okay, let me just look through my notes here. Okay. Yeah. All right, so some of you might remember me from JSConf. Oh, wait, this is all. I didn't realize. Do I have to? All right, well, you can't see it, but that's my name down there. There you go. I wonder what else you've missed so far. Yeah. All right, well, yes, that was me. So I had a great time listening. Didn't speak because I slept through it. No. I'm a UI engineer for Major League Baseball, a longtime JavaScripter, long-form improviser, and all-around nice guy. I'm known as Furf here and all around the internets. I've come to you today about your data, your never-ending lust, your insatiable taste for data and asynchronous data. And some sequential Ajax patterns that you can use for loading and combining your data, as well as a little library I wrote called Sexy, which makes it pretty easy. By a show of hands, how many people here have ever worked on an application that uses Ajax? And how many of you have built a page that made more than one request? And how many of you have wanted the two data points to interact meaningfully? Okay, anyone else can leave. This is about being able to combine data from different points. Well, that's where the story starts, and it turns out that there's a little more to Sexy, but we will wander down the garden path in a moment. So as we start integrating more and more data sources, we want our code to, be maintainable, logical. For me, at Major League Baseball, I just finished working on the new scoreboard page, which requires about 5 different data loads from different services. So before rendering every single thing, I wanted to unite the data beforehand. But I didn't want to wait for a chain series of events. I needed this to happen fast, and this is where the idea came from. Sequential Ajax allows you to make parallel requests and handle the callbacks in sequence, and Sexy makes Sequential Ajax sexy. So Sequential Ajax just refers to any Ajax pattern designed to handle multiple requests while maintaining a proper callback execution order. The goals of Sequential Ajax are basically to facilitate the combination of manipulation, make it easy for you to put these pieces of data together, to find some performance enhancement by using parallel asynchronous requests, to speed the execution of the callbacks. As data comes back, if all previous dependencies are there, go ahead and fire. If they haven't, wait. And when they get there, fire. And I think it should be fun, because I think programming is a lot of fun, and I love JavaScript, and I hate when my code gets uncomfortable, where I feel like I'm really kludging something in. So Sexy has helped make my job a lot easier and more fun. Plus, I get to respond to people on Twitter, as you saw before. So there's basically 3 types of sequential Ajax, at least that I've discerned. There's serial request, serial response, which waits to send a request once it receives the response from the previous call. There's parallel request, random response, where you send out the calls all at the same time and then use some sort of counter or other tracking variables to determine when all your data's arrived, and then merge it in some common callback. And then parallel request serial response, which is what Sexy is, which lets you fire everything at once and then handle it in order, no matter what order they come back. So in a perfect world, let's say we want to fire off 3 requests. The server goes out, does its thing. Those would be nice if they spun to indicate movement, but I think you get the picture that this data is going out and coming back. And it's really nice when it comes back in order, and it can share data with itself. But in a world where time waits for no man or his data, we fire out our 3 requests again. Something happened at response A, it slowed down, B gets there first. Well, those callbacks wait until they're triggered by the event of the success of A. So let's look at some sequential Ajax anti-patterns. Maybe if you see something familiar here, you'll want to stick around till the end. Here we are using Jquery. If anyone's unfamiliar with Jquery, I don't know, look it up real quick. But actually, feel free to just ask questions right now. But basically, each one of these lines up here is a JSON request. So you can see in the top line, we're requesting an article. In the second, we're requesting the comments. Now, this is sitting inside of the callback, so it has to wait for the article to return before we can go ahead and request the comments. We then bind the comments to the article and go ahead and render it to the page. The problem with this is, while it's relatively readable, it's slower. We have to wait. Request, response, request, response. And nested calls don't necessarily scale, at least not visually. I mean, you end up with code that looks like Charlie Brown on his back. Okay. All right, it's a zigzag. So the second anti-pattern is parallel request, random response. This pattern is quicker. These calls, though maybe not immediately obvious, are getting fired at the same time. Then they're using a counter. They're storing their data when they return and using a counter. And when that counter I gets to 2, it knows that it's finished with the number of requests, and it can send its common callback. Now, a problem with scaling this up is that you have to keep storage variables. You have to keep, anytime you add a call, you got to remember, go up, change your variable. And it just sort of ends up being a little bit crufty and long. I like code that's as small as possible, does what I want, and is easy to update and maintain. So if either one of these patterns look familiar, meet Sexy. Sexy is it started as a Jquery plugin. It's a parallel request serial response library. So we're making the requests in parallel for speed and wrapping and eventing your specified callbacks so that we can put them back in order. And Sexy ensures callbacks in order every time. Well, as of my arbitrary version 0.8.0, Sexy is now standalone, sort of, thanks to open source and John. I've extracted the Jquery Ajax code and put it in as an adapter. So if you look into the code, you'll see that it's in its own closure and it gets passed in as a variable to Sexy's closure as an adapter. The point of doing this was to make my own code easier to maintain. Every time there's a change to Jquery, I can update that. Anytime I have a change to my code, I can update that. And if anyone wants to port this to another library, it's easy to write an adapter for it. So Sexy is classy. Calling new Sexy creates a Sexy instance to which you can go ahead and start chaining your calls. But with a name like Sexy, which, by the way, wasn't out of any sense of ego, it actually was just another version of shortened Sequential Ajax. But after a while, I did think that this library had to be Sexy to keep up with its name. So I decided that new was old, and that Sexy is the new Sexy. So Sexy with parens also creates its own instance. You no longer need the new keyword to start your chain. And this is an instance. This is an object here. It's not actually working off of some Sexy singleton. And for anyone who wants under the hood, all we're doing inside of the constructor, we're checking when the function is called, we're checking the instance of this. If this is Sexy, then it was used with a new keyword. If it wasn't, it was called without a new keyword. We just take the arguments and we instantiate and just sort of wrap it back around. So the code will stop here and then come back through, saving us a few characters. And really, it was just for fun. But I didn't think that was sexy enough. Where am I going here? Oh, up is the new down, and down is the new up. There we go. So this will also create a sexy instance. I decided that most of the time I didn't need to put anything in those parentheses, so they just made my code look big. And so I decided to do away with them. This creates an instance as well. And we do this just by iterating the prototypal methods and creating static functions on the constructor, which will apply the desired prototype method in the scope of a new instance. Since it's a chainable API, it's always returning an instance. So after you make that first call, what you have back is your new object. All right, so let's take a look at Sexy's API. Sexy was designed to be expressive and chainable so that the code looks like what the code does. There's a method for each supported data type. These types reflect the jQuery roots, with the exception of the style method, which I added later for the sake of some sort of completeness, because I found that I was using Sexy to bootstrap apps by loading in scripts and then data, and I was using text to load a templating engine or a template that would get parsed by a template engine. I figured, all right, why don't I just put my CSS in there? It takes 2 to 3 callbacks, as you see. It takes arguments. There's a URL and a callback with an optional defer in the middle. Defer will force that call to perform the way our first example did as a serial request, serial response. This is going to allow you to handle things like server authentication if you need to set a cookie before you start hitting an API, or if you need an API key. Another benefit, if you want to change the configuration of the next call. If there's something that's going to be dependent on your previous call, you tell defer, and then in the callback, I'll show you how we can manipulate that next call. It also takes a jQuery settings object because of the jQuery roots, so you can refer to jQuery's documentation for that. There's an additional defer property so that you can use the long form and still stop your call. The callbacks are just slightly different from jQuery's Ajax callbacks, which return data and status. Instead, what we get are data, which is the response data of the current request. We get previous, which is the return value of the previous callback. We get next, which is the Ajax settings of the next request. And then we get the status, which hopefully, in your case, is always success. So let's look at what a sexy sequential Ajax pattern looks like. Here we can see that we're chaining 2 calls. These calls, like the other example, are being fired in parallel right away, and then the callbacks are executed in the specified order. This example is using the verbose syntax using full-on configuration objects. These would be what you would use if you want to post or if you need to add errors or before send. Where are we at here? Oh, this right here shows you how the value is being passed. So when the data comes back in the first one, we have the article. We're just going to take that data and we're going to return it. The wrapped callback knows that when it fires this one to pass it in as a second argument. Now we can just add comments to the article and go ahead and render it. But big configuration objects aren't sexy, so we use the brief syntax. You see that we're still passing the article and getting things done. But if I'm willing to get rid of 2 parentheses, I think I'm also willing to get rid of a function that is probably going to be used 90% of the time to pass, most of the time you're going to use this, it'll just be to marry 2 things. And so why not just throw in an implicit callback so that the data just appears. We don't need to write out that additional function. There's another type of implicit callback, which is a pass-through callback. So if you throw either a JS or a CSS call in between, odds are we have no interest in manipulating those data. We're just going to put them in the page and execute them. So we pass through whatever the last return value was before it. You could throw as many JavaScripts or style sheets right in the middle there, and that second argument would still be article. I don't really recommend that because it's not really readable. I think it's better to put your two things together, but if you had to, it's available to you. Here's an example using defer. This example actually was inspired by something Maroc's doing with Hookio. He's using sexy as a test runner. So he wanted to be able to authenticate, request, modify, and post back. So in the first call, we are authenticating. You could use this either with a cookie-based session, or if you needed an API key back, because if you had an API key, you could just send that through into previous, and your next call would be able to make an authenticated request. The second call, you can see, we deferred, we waited, we called true, we went, we got the article, we modified the article, and then what we did, by deferring the third call, which is going to post the article, back here in the second, we can set the article to the data of that call, and now this third call is now armed and dangerous and ready to update your article. And for sake of completion, we log out when we're done. Because of the parallel loading sequential response and the way that both Jquery and Sexy use text loading of scripts and then DOM injection, we're actually able to go ahead and queue up script dependencies. So anything you see here will load after the thing before it. So Jquery UI doesn't have to worry that Jquery won't be there, and the template doesn't have to worry. And as you can see, all my pseudo MLB libraries, they'll load just fine as soon as they're written. So let's see what a sexy makeover looks like. We can remember our original parallel response, parallel request random response. That now is reduced to this, making the code tidy and readable, and I don't know, sexy. I like it. Sexy also has a few additional methods. It has a setup method that allows you to configure subsequent requests of a sexy instance. This behaves just like Ajax setup in Jquery. Only when you do it, it's not global. It's only to subsequent requests in your current sexy chain. At any point, you can go ahead and unset them with an empty or falsy value to set up. Something like this. For our article, we may want to show a loading indicator and then hide it when it's complete, but we may not care so much when we display the comments, so we can just zero that out. You can also pass that right through to the constructor, because anywhere I can drop keystrokes, I do, saving yourself some time. Sexy also provides a sort of client-side JavaScript packaging tool called Sexy Bundle. Bundle makes multiple requests and a single DOM insertion, and then executes an optional callback. Because of the way Sexy is designed, the script sequence and therefore your dependencies are preserved. So that long chain of script loads can be reduced to this. I guess we didn't really save much, but I mean, I'm nickel and diming over parentheses, so I do what I can here. So now I'd like to introduce you to what has become so far my Kama Sutra of Sexy. This example just came up the other day at Major League Baseball, where we had to implement in a hurry a new scoreboard for minor leagues. The only problem was that the data about the games that were being played was stored in a separate place from the data about the games. Each game required a different data file. So came up with this idea, and here's an example of bootstrapping an app and then really playing with Sexy. So this time what's different is up at the top, we are storing our Sexy instance as S, which will come back later, foreshadowing. We're going to load in Jquery. We'll load in a templating agent, templating document. We'll also load in a style sheet, and we will load in the template. Now, all right, this is a basic simple friends. This isn't our scoreboard because that had a little more code. This JSON that it would bring back is sort of like a manifest. It might bring back an array of friends with just their usernames and IDs. So from there, we have to go and get the rest of the information. So what we do is we iterate those friends. And for each friend, we make a request. So what we're doing is we're actually adding these new calls to that original chain. So these are all going to fire as fast as this loop can iterate. All the requests go out. When it comes back, we're going to push the incoming friend onto a stack. And then, wait a minute, there's no stack. Well, one of the nice things was that we added this to this chain, so all I did was create the stack down here. And we passed that empty array up there. So the first time it comes in, we have our array, we push our friend, we loop through this while we are less than the final friend. And every time we augment that array and push it back up onto the stack. So our friends array just grows as our responses come back in. And when we're done, we shove it into a template and put it on the page. So there are some known issues, but they're not unique to Sexy. Right now, as far as I know, there's not too many, or if any. Kyle may be able to correct me in some of these with some of the stuff he's doing in Lab.js. Detection of errors for remote requests using JSONP script or style, which is loading a remote style sheet. Probably the more severe problem that I've introduced is that loading a style from a remote URL will fire the success callback even if the request was an error. But the good news is most of the time you don't need to do something right after your style sheet, so just kind of avoid that for now. Some people might say I should wait until the library is complete, but I say, if I put it out there and everyone can see the bug, maybe someone has the fix. So now we've just witnessed parallel request, serial response. The pros, it's faster, cleaner, prettier. I think it's easier to maintain. The API is chainable and expressive. You can look at the code, know what it's doing when it's doing it. And the only drawback is that depending whether or not you're using it as a plugin or a standalone, it's going to add about 1.5 or 4.5K of code to your core library. If you're using the standalone, odds are you're using it to bootstrap. So it could potentially be the only script on your page when you load. All right. If anyone has any questions, you have a question, sir.
Do you have any kind of timeout handling in case like a request is taking too long or something like that to do something?
Built into jQuery.
Okay, so it's using, but for like JSONP, which doesn't have a timeout handling in jQuery.
And whose fault is that?
Well, okay.
I'm just standing on the shoulders of jQuery. Yeah, I haven't added any. In fact, the most meaningful code that I've added could probably, if I wanted to, I could have just taken out what I've done instead of having a separate library, and in like maybe 6 to 10 lines, added it directly to jQuery. There's really not much going on. I'm wrapping functions, creating events, but the Sexy library really doesn't do much. It just, helps.
I do have one follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you have any shorthand or anything? So like if a particular request fails for some reason, to redo that request, that exact same request, or do you have to actually, in your error callback, like do s dot and add that one back onto it?
Right. So this is still an earlier version, so my arbitrary 0.8 should probably be more like 0.5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. I've done various things and pulled them out and put them back and pulled them out. Now that I do have a couple people using it, I probably have to be a little more stable. But yes, there was at one point cascading error handling that would notify everything down the chain. There wasn't something that would actually send back up to that same request, but in one incarnation, I had the ability to inject back into the chain. So essentially what we would need to do is inject into the chain and then set the pointer back. So I could add, let's say, another argument to the callback being this, that would give you access to everything in the Sexy chain, and then add some functions, previous, next, to jump around. Not currently there, but if people use this and like it, I am more than happy to add whatever people like. Kyle?
Yes, so you had your list of a bunch of scripts, and obviously a bunch of those were local scripts. And you're using XHR to load those, right? Mm-hmm. And you're loading them all in parallel, executing them serially. What if one of those in the middle is a remote script? What does Sexy do?
Okay, so Sexy it has to, in order to ensure that everything else is there, it has to wait, because in order to put a remote script on, I'm using just adding a script node and giving it a source. So it's actually injecting right then and there. What Sexy does is, if there is a defer anywhere in the chain, but everything else is freeform, like everything else is ready to go parallel, the second that one that was deferred comes back, those will all immediately fire again. So as it's iterating through, or as you're adding things to the chain, it will either, if it's the first thing, immediately send. Otherwise, if it has been something that's deferred, it will essentially subscribe to the send of the last deferred item. So they'll all fire off in a hurry right after that remote script loads.
So just by point of comparison, that's where LabJS would differ. LabJS is still going to load everything in parallel, remote, or local, but it had some other trade-offs that yours didn't have to make.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely, I mean, we've talked about this on and off over the past year. There's plenty, I think, that I could, leverage from digging into your code, and yeah. So I look forward to, after this, now that the stress is done, I can go relax and I can actually pick your brain with a clear conscience. Anyone else have any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.